Oh, yeah.
Bushman, Sullivan, copy at White 6.
That's a weapon.
Yeah. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18.
We'll call for change by Charlie Mike Bravo.
Speed 37.
Copy Red White 6, Bushman, 6 Romeo.
Fucking break.
Hotel 26 is Crazy Horse 18. Have individuals with weapons.
Radio. We have Bandits 1-4.
Yep, he's got a weapon too. Hotel 26, Crazy Horse 18. Have fun.
Bushman, Sullivan, copy
We got an RPG.
Alright, we got a guy with an RPG.
I'm gonna fire.
Bushman, Sullivan, copy
We got an RPG.
Alright, we got a guy with an RPG.
I'm gonna fire.
Hold on, let's come around. We gotta go from our point of view. Yeah, we got a guy shooting. Now he's behind the building.
Yeah.
He was right in front of the Brad, about there 1 o'clock. Haven't seen anything since then.
Just fucking, once you get on, just open up.
again, Roger. I see your element. You got about 4 Humvees right along this.
You're clear.
Alright, firing.
Line here. With the stage line. Let me know when you gather.
Light them all up.
Come on, fire.
Hey, Roger.
Keep shooting. Keep shooting.
He's getting up.
If he has a weapon in his hand.
Never in human history have populations suffered the tyranny of despotic governments more than the 20th century. For every time despots take control, their first aim is to disarm their intended victims.
The lesson the 20th century teaches is that governments have killed more people than all of the wars combined because the vast mass of people had previously been disarmed.
Sometimes it happens overnight. Other times it takes a few decades. And the establishment will have the arms and the monopoly of arms, and so there's no check or balance on that arbitrary tyranny.
And so all tyrants throughout history, including present history, must make sure that the people they have conquered do not have the physical means of resistance.
And quite frankly, if the American colonists had not been well armed, they would never have had their revolution.
Since colonial times, Americans have understood this, that a free nation is a function of an armed populace. And the founders reflected these realities in 4 places in the U.S. Constitution, the most famous being the Second Amendment. This amendment states, "A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed."
When you disarm a population, you leave them open to the worst criminals of all, which are government criminals. There have been more deaths due to the genocide and democide of governments in the 20th century than all the wars put together.
Unfortunately, the mainstream media, influenced by anti-constitutional interests, rarely mentions any of this, nor do they ask the obvious question: if the Second Amendment says we're supposed to be a free state, how come we're fast approaching a police state?
Everything we see in the Declaration of Independence is decrying the police state and the reasons that the founders stood up against it.
How could we have allowed our politicians to establish a Department of Homeland Security when all 50 states already have Departments of Homeland Security provided by the U.S. Constitution itself?
The reason why we have Department of Homeland Security, even though we already have the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and Marine Corps, and federal law enforcement, is because the powers that be fully intend to create their own version of the SS, their own version of the KGB. That is what the DHS is.
People don't like to hear this, but if you look through history at the horrible regimes of Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, whoever, they were funded by the law-abiding taxpayers.
The Patriot Act and other statutes have opened the door to not only a police state, but a surveillance state, complete with TSA agents at our airports, warrantless searches, wiretapping of our phones, drones in the skies, and assaults to internet-free speech.
Patriot Act and other pieces of legislation has made things much worse. There was a problem, we had to deal with it, but they made it completely worse. This whole idea that all we have to do is sacrifice liberties and make government bigger, spend more money. Before 9/11, we were spending $40 billion on security. And now it's over $80 billion they spend on it, and the Department of Homeland Security is expanding and TSA is expanding, so they've done everything completely wrong.
The war on terror is really a war against the liberties of the American people.
These civil liberty abuses are so frequently suppressed by the media, concerned citizens can only get full spectrum news from non-U.S. outlets.
Well, mainstream media are dominated in journalism. The major newspapers, the New York Times, Boston Globe, Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, Chicago Tribune even today, all three major networks, two of the three major cable companies, and I would say most of the Washington press corps.
Why did MSNBC, CNN, and even Fox News hardly report the passage of the NDAA, a rogue act which permits indefinite detention of American citizens?
The mainstream media in all of the Western world is dominated by people who I would describe as collectivists. They're people who believe that the state should be all-powerful, that the people should serve the state. It's quite different from the American Republic as it was originally conceived, where we believed that the state should serve the people, if the people were in charge, and that the state would be the servant. And people now believe that the state is supreme and the people should serve the state. And if that's the case, then people cannot have the physical means of resisting the state, so they must not have weapons of any kind because they have to be submissive to the state. And so therefore, the media and all of these groups support the concept of disarming the people so they cannot challenge the supreme power of the government.
Why does one have to go to RTTV to be informed that the Department of Homeland Security recently purchased 450 million rounds of hollow point ammunition? Ammunition that's illegal in war under the Hague Convention of 1899. Who is this ammunition intended for? And why does the land of the free incarcerate more than any other nation on earth?
We have the biggest prison population in the world because it's a privatized prison population that teams up with government to guarantee on record 90% occupancy. And the very same private prison industries in the last 50 years lobby for laws now where a guy in Florida released a few heart-shaped balloons for his girlfriend and has been charged with a felony. That's why I'm against the '68 Gun Control Act, because it's written to deny, quote, criminals guns, but they're making everybody a criminal. So they can get you into the system and then strip your Bill of Rights, your Constitution, your right as an American citizen away from you.
The mainstream media fails to adequately report on all of these issues, especially the real purposes of the Second Amendment. Looking around, some would disagree that Thomas Paine's noblest, purest Constitution resulted in a nation that had the power to begin the world over again. For America today is looking more like the old world, a repressive order that colonists sought to escape 520 years ago.
They were ruled by tyrants and despots and magistrates of every type. They were told what to think and how to live. Our entire legal process and the laws upon which we were founded recognize the individuality, the uniqueness of mankind as created by God.
The United States is unique in all of human history because first, we were 13 colonies that broke away from the greatest empire on earth and established our separate existence as a country through force of arms, and then created the first great democratic republic in world history, which eventually became the greatest nation on earth.
Let's take a closer look at the U.S. Constitution, in particular the Second Amendment, and see if we the people are applying it properly, as the Founding Fathers intended. The U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. This means all other laws, statutes, regulations, codes, executive orders, and even Supreme Court precedents are secondary.
The Constitution itself in Article 6 declares that it is the supreme law of the land. And essentially that relates to laws that are passed by subsidiary bodies such as the states or localities. And outside of the process of amendment, there is no law that can override the Constitution.
The Constitution is comprised of basically two parts, the Articles and the Amendments. There are 7 articles and 27 amendments. Amendments are places where something has been added, changed, or deleted in the articles. The first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights, and they were drafted shortly after the 7 articles were written. Certain founders wanted to make absolutely sure we the people retained certain rights the new federal government could never take away.
People wanted some absolute guaranteed bedrock rights. Hey, the federal government's not all powerful. Those rights are reserved to the states or the people.
Among these are the right of the people to keep and bear arms. This right, stated in the Second Amendment, is one of the most famous of our rights. And since the Second Amendment is part of the U.S. Constitution, it too is the highest law in the land. Thus, no law, statute, Supreme Court ruling, or gun regulation takes priority over the Second Amendment.
Even if it's popular, even if the great majority of people want to do it, like all these polls you see nowadays where they run around and see whether or not people support gun control, as if that would make it okay. That does not fly in a constitutional republic. People tend to give up their freedom and set aside their rights when they're afraid of a foreign invader, when they're afraid of calamity and chaos inside their own society, crime, for example. That's when they tend to give up their rights.
All of pre-constitutional American history, from the first colonies in 1650 onward, confirms that the right of the people to keep and bear arms was everywhere. Not only did citizens have the right to keep and bear arms, they had the duty to keep and bear arms.
So if you look at the history of the militia and what we now talk about as the right of the people to keep and bear arms, you will see that actually it was a near universal duty of all able-bodied men in the colonial period to possess and to bear arms when they were necessary to defend the community.
But certain interests, known as the gun control lobby, never acknowledged this. Instead, gun controllers infringed the Second Amendment with all manner of schemes and bogus legal theories.
Yeah, I know why sales of these weapons have been soaring in the last few days. It's down to idiots like you. Mr. Pratt, thank you for joining me.
There's every form of fraud and quack-filled, quack-driven theory out there to push the idea that disarming the people as a whole, as if there's some guilt-ridden mass of criminals, will transport us to some wondrous utopia when Chicago, New York, and other cities that have essentially banned citizen ownership of guns have crime rates in some cases 10 times that of areas that have high rates of gun ownership.
And the ones on the opposite side that have limited gun restriction have the least crime.
The gun controllers have dreamed up every nasty name they can to replace the simple word arms. Terms like assault weapons, gangster weapons, Saturday night specials, and cop killers flood the mainstream media to toxify the Second Amendment.
Well, there's an old saying, to kill a dog, you must first call it mad. And it's typical of the propagandist that when he wants to achieve something that we could consider a scurrilous result, he applies some nasty epithet to the victim or the target. So if you look at the term assault rifle, it's that word assault. Or if you look at the term Saturday Night Special, that's directed to the accessibility of types of firearms. Then the concept of cop killer bullet, of course, draws the picture of the police officer being shot down in the line of duty. So if one were to follow the logic of that terminology to its ultimate extreme, most ammunition would have to be banned. And of course, that's the ultimate purpose. They either want to remove from the average person's possession a particular type of firearm, such as the so-called assault rifle, or make certain firearms inaccessible because only the rich can afford them. That's the Saturday Night Special logic. Or in the ultimate extreme, remove the ability to use most firearms by banning essentially all forms of ammunition.
Where gun controllers can't demonize arms with nasty names, they work to limit their possession to what they call gun-free zones. The feel-good modifier, gun-free, is then attached to all manner of places. Thus, we get gun-free schools, gun-free airports, gun-free movie theaters, or simply gun-free zones. If these zones are generalized enough, they could theoretically be expanded to encompass the entire nation, if not the world. It should be obvious this is what the gun controllers are trying to do.
Some of the strongest proponents in Texas came from people they've lost families because nobody was there with a gun that could have stopped some madman. So no, I think it would be less. It's never going to be a perfect society, but if we have total dependency on the government to take care of us and protect us, you can expect only bad results and bureaucracy and a lot of money spent and civil liberties violated.
Gun-free zone is a particularly dangerous place for one to be, because theoretically there's nobody there that's going to be able to defend you or anybody else against a criminal who cares not to obey the gun-free zone sign. In fact, there's every reason to think that the most recent mass murderer sought out the school because he knew it would be a soft target.
One can only hope that even the dullest of Americans will realize that any gun-free zone is actually a self-defense prohibition zone. Thus, a place where criminals and psychopaths are able to have their way with unarmed citizens.
Some people argue that being armed will increase crime, but there's no evidence for this. And actually, this whole idea of a permit for concealed carry, it's better than not being allowed to own a gun, but it really isn't the solution. Everybody should have this right to conceal it or not conceal it. Ultimately, this provides a safer society, and I think some of these rampages could be stopped in the middle of them.
Pundits never mention any of this, a clue that their gun control body's real objective is the eventual elimination of the right to keep and bear, leaving we the people defenseless against whatever usurpation and tyranny will surely follow. Nazi Germany, with its resultant Holocaust, serves as a perfect example.
So when you look at the egregious and copious laws that have been levied against the right of the people to keep and bear arms, the founders wanted to be sure that the federal government understood that they had no power to infringe upon the right of the people to keep and bear arms.
The Constitution is every American's reason, license, and permission to keep and bear arms. But judges often take issue with this. They wantonly abridge, infringe, or sacrifice fundamental rights on the grounds of some compelling governmental interest to act for the greater good.
Socrates was asked, justice is in the interest of the subjects or is justice in the interest of the state? Now, the state does have a lawful constitutional mandate to protect itself. So this is where the the paradox occurs. People have a right to overthrow government, but government also has the constitutional responsibility to repel insurrection.
But as Justice Hugo Black argued in Konigsberg v. State Bar of California, a government's most compelling interest is to protect its citizens in the enjoyment of life, liberty, and property. In fact, the only reason a citizen owes his allegiance is in exchange for such protection.
We forget this often, of course, but under our form of government and our theory of government, not only the primary but the only legitimate function of government is the exercise of force to protect yours and my inherent inalienable rights.
But priorities are now so twisted. If Congress enacted a law which required we the people to surrender our arms to the bat fee for immediate destruction, gun control nuts would think to do so demonstrated allegiance.
Well, there are a number of actions that an individual could take if the government were to demand surrender of firearms. The first, of course, would be to bring some kind of judicial challenge, go into court and seek to have a declaratory judgment, injunction, or whatever entered. The second would be to pass specific statutes that preclude that action from taking place, that public officials cannot attempt to confiscate guns because the members of the militia would be required to possess those firearms. And of course, the third possibility is that people would simply not comply. And if large enough numbers of people refused to comply and it was made manifest, that would probably deter that type of legislation.
Self-defense is the only recourse citizens have from common criminals when the police are not around. More ominously, self-defense is the only recourse citizens have in the event usurpers employ the police powers of the state to tyrannical ends. Given this, any government that intentionally makes self-defense complicated or impossible puts an end to the citizens' reciprocal obligation of allegiance. For such government is little more than a criminal conspiracy of rogue politicians operating under the guise of constitutional authority.
Dianne Feinstein on 60 Minutes and other programs has said on record, our goal is that Mr. and Mrs. America turn in their firearms.
Mr. and Mrs. America, turn them all in. I would have done it.
And now they want their registration program, they want home inspections, they want you to get $1 million of liability insurance to own a gun. They want to make owning a firearm basically the equivalent of being a registered sex offender. And if they move for wider gun control, wider gun confiscation, we have to simply refuse to comply.
The American people must say no.
The very existence of any law intended to further a criminal conspiracy is thus itself a perfect legal reason for disobeying its commands.
Any law, so-called law, contrary to the Constitution, is no law at all. It is null and void from inception. It has no force or effect. You owe no allegiance or obedience to that law or to those who would attempt to impose it upon you. If you give up your right to bear arms, all else is lost. If the government were to demand that citizens turn in their weapons, the constitutionally savvy response would be, come and take them.
Spartans, lay down your weapons!
MOLON LABE, come and get them, as Leonidas bellowed to the Persian envoy at the Battle of Thermopylae in 350 BC.
Come and get them!
300 Spartans held back the entire Persian army which was invading the Greek islands and Greece itself. And apparently Leonidas told one of his Spartans whom he sent back to go tell the Athenians that we stand here loyal to our cause. And it is one of the great stories of human defiance and one of the most important stories in Western history because Greece was itself the incubator of Western democracy, and had it been overrun by the Persians and occupied for a long period of time, Many, many things that happened to the West might never have happened.
To be sure, patriots should continue to seek relief in the courts, legislatures, and voting booths, if only to prove to the world who are the aggressors. Unfortunately, given the types of judges who now infest the bench, it is likely they will lift not a finger to assist we the people, just as their precursors refused to assist we the people when Franklin D. Roosevelt seized, many say stole, Americans' gold in 1933.
What FDR did was, in my judgment, illegal, unconstitutional, and immoral. We are in the condition that we're in today economically because of that decision that was made many years ago to refute sound money principles.
When Franklin Delano Roosevelt confiscated gold through the government, he took away the property of the citizens. Instead of defending the property, he stole the property. So it's axiomatic that that act alone was a direct violation of the purpose of the American Constitution.
Thus, the great question facing this generation is whether it's enough to just rely on the last part of the Second Amendment and ignore the first, which states a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state.
So the right of the people to keep and bear arms clause of the Second Amendment really takes us back to the purpose, which is a free state to be secured through a militia. The right of the people to keep and bear arms, therefore, is what is necessary to maintain that kind of militia structure.
The founders were concerned that government, particularly the new federal government in Washington, be able to be kept in check by state militias, by the militia of the people.
Would the founders write something into the Constitution that had no meaning, purpose, or effect? The Supreme Court asked this same question in Marbury v. Madison and concluded that it cannot be presumed that any clause in the Constitution is intended to be without effect. In fact, the Supreme Court asked and answered this question in 5 additional cases. For example, in Williams v. United States, the High Court found, in expounding the Constitution of the United States, every word must have its due force and appropriate meaning, for it is evident from the whole instrument that no word was unnecessarily used or needlessly added.
The law is what it says, and it's meant to be taken at its word. And one can never presume that there's some provision in a law that was meant or ought to be disregarded. Now, people sometimes say, well, there are provisions in the Constitution that are somehow out of date today. Third Amendment, about the quartering of troops in private homes. But who's to say that that type of abuse would not arise today, and some public officials would try to quarter troops in private homes?
When I argued the case that if you want to go to war in committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, if you want to go to war, you have to have a declaration of war, and made them vote on that. Of course, they wouldn't do. They said that part of the Constitution is anachronistic. So it's that attitude that has to be addressed. What about the monetary issue? They don't follow the rules on the monetary issue. So you could rewrite and deal with the imperfections and try to improve it, but it's the attitude of the people and the attitude of our representatives about the respect for the rule of law that has gone badly.
So, if the Founding Fathers acknowledged the necessity of a militia in the Second Amendment, and the Supreme Court ruled that every clause is intended to have effect, how can we ignore the idea that a well-regulated militia is necessary? Maybe we simply don't understand what the militia is or why they are necessary.
The militia of the several states differ from other institutions like the standing army, police, and other organizations in community defense in that they are a constitutionally mandated body of the people in arms. Much like the jury, you only trust the people themselves with judgment over their fellow man. You also trust the people themselves with their own security, with securing a free state. And as the Constitution makes clear in the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia is necessary for the security of a free state.
Perhaps the best way to describe the militia is to begin with an explanation of what it is not. The militia is not the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, or even the troops. It's not the National Guard, Coast Guard, or the police. It's also not some vigilante group, UN peacekeepers, or NATO. A militia is a citizen-based state institution of self-defense, similar in spirit to volunteer firefighters.
The Army of the United States exists by sufferance of Congress. The Navy of the United States, if we have a Navy in the United States, exists by the sufferance of Congress. The militia of the several states are not such. Their very existence is not even dependent on the Constitution of the United States, let alone the sufferance of Congress. So they have an independence and a locality. They are the original instruments of the exercise of the sovereign sword of the people of the United States.
Philosophically, the militia could be said to have originated 2,000 years ago with Mark 12:31 in the New Testament. Love thy neighbor as thyself. With this comes the idea of self-defense and the obligation to protect loved ones as well as citizens of the community.
In both Testaments, the Bible is replete with examples of good, godly men and women who resisted evil, wicked government, sometimes by force. The verse is often used where Simon Peter, in trying to defend Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, the Lord told Peter to put up his sword. He did not tell him to give up his sword. The Bible is absolutely replete with the principle of self-defense as being given to us by our Creator God. As Christians, we are not violence-prone, but whenever those who are wicked and evil assert their power against us and attempt to take away the fundamental rights that our Creator God has given us, then they have crossed the line, and we have every right under God to defend ourselves, our families, our community, our liberty, etc.
Sir William Blackstone, the founder's legal mentor, argued that the right to self-defense was meaningless unless the citizen was able to effectuate that self-defense.
The right of self-defense is inherent in the natural rights of men. These rights are granted by the Creator. Now, the only way you can maintain your life in this world where there's a lot of evil is very often to engage in vigorous self-defense in the protection of yourself, your family, your property, your home, your country.
It's thus only natural that the earliest colonies would carry forward these principles. In fact, just about every one of the 13 colonies had a militia in one form or another, even 150 years before the Constitution was drafted.
The militia were active in the American colonies from the very beginning. If you look at every colonial charter where the king granted certain powers to his favorites to go over to North America and set up some kind of colony, he always directed them to form what later became militia, to arm and train all of the inhabitants of these plantations, as they were called. War of Independence comes, the states are no longer colonies, they continue with their militia structures. The Constitution is ratified and it incorporates the militia of the several states. And Congress, in fact, is required to organize, arm, discipline, and provide for the training of the militia and to call them forth for certain purposes of the general government of the United States. So Congress cannot remove them from the system. So they're permanent parts of the structure in the same way that Congress, the President, the Supreme Court, and the states are permanent parts of the structure.
The militia in most states continued on for another 150 until they were phased out by the military-industrial complex that President Eisenhower warned us about.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. the potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
We have a national emergency, something going on. Central authority or federal government takes over and brings in all of the militia from the states, forms them into a giant army that is then used against, in the case of the Civil War, the rebels in the South. But then after the war is over, these armies continue to exist. And they weren't gonna, because they keep saying, well, we have threat to the nation. The threat's still there.
So the threat's bigger than ever. The other problem we've got is the proliferation of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction.
So they always keep you on tetherhooks by suggesting that there's always this threat out there to the nation that may not be as bad as government wants you to believe.
The framers were very sensitive to the danger of a standing army. They had just fought off the tyranny of the king's standing army. And so they did not want to see their new government with a continuing army.
Given this history, it is easy to see that the militia not only predates the states, but predates the United States as well. This is why the Constitution doesn't bother to specifically define the word militia. In 1776, everyone knew what the militia were.
Today, most people are convinced the militia is the U.S. government running the state National Guard, and which is not the militia. The militia means that people should have their own weapons and defend themselves, and it's sort of an amplification of, say, local sheriffs with posses defending their local turf.
The only thing that's even resembling the militia are sheriffs who understand the Constitution, which puts strong limits on what the federal government can do, and who are using their posses and their deputies to stand between the federal government and the people of their counties.
But let's take a deeper look at the militia and try to discover why the founders felt it was necessary to the security of a free state.
The phrase revitalization of the militia means taking the more or less moribund structure that we now have, the so-called unorganized militia, and applying to it the necessary constitutional principles of organization. And of course that would mean, number one, near universal membership by all adults, number two, possession of firearms by most adults, number three, some kind of training. We go down the list.
Unfortunately, some wrongly assume that the purpose of revitalizing the militia is to fight new battles of Lexington and Concord.
Because most of what the militia would do under contemporary conditions would relate to natural disasters, industrial accidents, food shortages, perhaps economic crisis of some kind. You can run down a whole list. Now, ultimately, if there were a threat to the free state, then the militia would come into play, obviously in a Lexington and Concord type situation.
And if they ever did that, we would outnumber the standing army 100 to 1.
Thus, the ultimate purpose for revitalizing the militia of the several states is to reassert the people's control over the federal government.
The federal government is supposed to be a government of enumerated and limited powers, and yet they've twisted and interpreted the Constitution to mean the exact opposite. The federal government has all powers not expressly forbidden.
Fortunately, we don't have to rely on even the Second Amendment by itself, for the Constitution acknowledges and describes the functions of militia in 3 additional clauses. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16, and Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15 states that the Congress may call forth the militia for 3 purposes: to execute the laws of the Union, to suppress insurrections, and to repel invasions.
By giving power to Congress to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining, we gave ourselves the ability, the mechanism to create over time a greater degree of uniformity in arms, in tactics, in strategy, our ability to fight together. We also gave to Congress the power to govern such part of the militia as might be called into the actual service of the United States, and we've exercised that power from the very beginning of the very first Militia Act passed shortly after the adoption of the Constitution.
Contrary to the gun control lobby's mission to disband the militia, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16 clearly shows that Congress is supposed to nurture the militia. After all, the exact language of suppressing insurrections and repelling invasions sure sounds like what the Department of Homeland Security claims they have a mandate to do. But do they?
Well, I think there's no doubt the Department of Homeland Security wants to take over, and they would want to reverse everything that the militia stands for. They want to hold guns, and they don't want the people to hold guns. The people are bad because they're a danger to us. So yes, it's just another attempt to centralize power. Our founders would be aghast of that because they didn't want to have a national police force. They didn't want standing armies even. So it's quite a bit different. So I think that whole trend toward the Department of Homeland Security is a very bad sign. The reason I voted against it and the reason I vote to try to stop it.
Even though far more people die from car crashes, heart attacks, lightning strikes, and even peanut butter allergies than terrorism, the Department of Homeland Security is attempting to usurp power from the states, rationalized by the so-called War on Terror.
9/11, in my judgment, was not a false flag operation. It was an attack upon this country by Al-Qaeda and utilizing 19 fanatics who drove those planes into those buildings. And I don't believe that, that another country did that or had any hand in that whatsoever.
Whether 9/11 was a staged false flag or not, it really doesn't matter because they've used it to demonize the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, returning veterans, gun owners, conservatives in the fetters. But if you look at 9/11, the official story is a fraud. Clearly there were criminal elements in the government allowing it to happen, knowing that they could radically re-engineer our society into the oppressive state it's becoming.
It should be obvious that these usurpers are just using this as an excuse to amass power by promoting fear to a mainstream, media propagandized public.
The war on terror is an abstraction. What is terror? Well, it's that which makes people afraid or fearful. But since people have different fear levels, any American is a potential terrorist if they do anything that causes the establishment to become uncomfortable.
The U.S. Constitution makes clear that the militia are supposed to guarantee security, not some department patched together by usurpers in Washington, D.C., operating on a global domination plan for what they deceptively call a new American century.
In the name of the war on terror, the federal government is passing all kinds of egregious edicts, such as the Patriot Act, Military Commissioners Act, NDAA, et cetera, which trample the fundamental freedoms of the American people, take away our constitutional liberties, such as the Fourth Amendment. So who is really being terrorized here?
The so-called war on terror is really a psychological war against the people of the world, certainly including the American people, and who will then accept any insult to their liberties in the name of defending themselves and providing security. It's as simple as that.
And 9/11 was nothing more than an invasion that New York's militia should have repelled.
Congress is given the power to call forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, repel invasions, and then is given the power to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and to provide for governing such part of the militia as are called forth in the employment of the United States. And then the states are given the authority to train the militia according to the discipline that's prescribed by Congress, and the exclusive authority to appoint the officers of the militia, other than the president, of course, who's the commander-in-chief.
The 3 militia clauses became part of the supreme law of the land, even before the Second Amendment was adopted. The militia are thus intimately baked into the Constitution, and the Second Amendment is just icing on the cake.
The 4 most ignored words in the English language: a well-regulated militia. That's found at the beginning of the first half of the Second Amendment. Why is it everyone starts midway through the sentence?
The militia are so important, they rank amongst 7, and only 7, institutions the Constitution specifically names and treats as permanent. These institutions, in order of importance, are we the people, the militia, the states, the United States, the Congress, the President, the Supreme Court.
The militia are composed of the people themselves, and they exercise the ultimate power of government, the power of the sword. So it's putting the militia at the very highest level because the Constitution does not identify Congress, the President, the Supreme Court, or even the states as necessary to the security of a free state or necessary to the security of anything for that matter. Only the militia are identified as necessary.
The militia rank alongside we the people themselves, because the militia are the people. In fact, the people's very sovereignty depends on our control of the power of the sword through our militia. The astute citizen will note that neither the Army, the Navy, nor any department can claim a constitutionally mandated existence. Nor can they exist at all unless Congress specifically acts. The militia, on the other hand, exist whether Congress acts or not.
Who wants to be governed? Nobody. But we all want to be protected, don't we? And the purpose of the American Constitution, if you read it very carefully, and the Bill of Rights in particular, is not to govern the people, but to protect.
The Constitution does not recognize a militia of the United States.
And it's because of this unconstitutional act that Congress passed, Title 10, the militia of the United States. There's no such thing as the militia. It's unconstitutional right on its face. They are state institutions, and prior to the state institutions, they were colonial institutions. This is 300 years of historical as well as statutory history there.
The President may only call forth a state militia for the 3 constitutional purposes, and the Governor is under no obligation to accede to such a call if he feels the mission is unconstitutional. Militia deployment is yet another check and balance the founders built into our constitutional system to prevent the federal government from usurping power.
The whole idea of the militia was to protect the states against the federal government. It was to be one of the very serious, tangible checks and balances against a federal government that might conceivably grow beyond the limits of what are in primarily Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. There are only about 18 things the federal government is supposed to do, and a lot of the rest of what we have going on in Washington simply is not constitutional.
Because the Constitution guarantees the permanent existence of the militia as integral elements of the balance of power, the President, the Congress, the Supreme Court, nor any state can disarm them. For disarmed militia are no militia at all. Thus, if Congress, influenced by some gun control lobby, neglects to provide appropriate arming of the militia, as stipulated in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 16, the states must arm their militia anyway and take legal action to thwart any unconstitutional legislation passed under the influence of the gun controllers.
It's pretty obvious, I think, by now that the so-called gun control lobby that seeks to disarm Americans really, if you look at who they are, almost all of them have some kind of a direct or indirect financial or political tie to the government itself. And since we know that governments, especially powerful, tyrannical governments, do not want citizens to be armed, and they're all for gun control, it's not difficult to understand why the people who are either in government or who are dependent upon government or close to government in some way should be in the vanguard calling for gun control. They do not want people to be armed to resist a tyrannical government because they are part of that tyrannical government.
Thomas Jefferson said that the one thing that was essential to the maintenance of liberty was that people never lose what he called the spirit of resistance. Whenever we see any attempt to strip us of our fundamental freedoms, especially the freedom of the right to keep and bear arms, there can be no compromise. The line in the sand must be drawn on this issue, or the First Amendment and all the other amendments to our Constitution are really irrelevant.
The founders wrote the U.S. Constitution so we, the people, would always have our state militia to guarantee there will be no repeat of tyranny like that suffered under King George.
King George III was an angel compared to people we have running the New World Order today. The final equation, what we face, is a much, much darker thing than our forebears did. Politically, militarily, they were facing an enemy just as powerful, who'd never been defeated before. They were ragtag. King George was just an oppressive pig who wanted to suck off people.
It is foolish, however, to think that tyrants and usurpers only existed in 1776. Such mentalities are quite active today. And when such tyrants and usurpers enact gun control statutes banning weapons that compromise the militia's ability to perform their duties, again, any state so affected has the constitutional authority to counter such rogue statutes by enacting its own legislation, requiring its citizens to possess the banned weapons for militia duty anyway.
When you have a dictatorship or an authoritarian government, truth becomes treasonous.
There are even limits on freedom of speech. There should be on our right to own a gun as well.
So if states simply revitalize their militia, and one of the clauses in that revitalization statute says, well, every member of our militia is required to possess a firearm, then he can treat that, and the state government will treat that as a militia firearm, and of course the militia are governmental institutions, then all of those individuals within each state would now come under the exemptions or exceptions of the gun control statutes that already exist.
Thus, a federal statute from the gun controllers banning rifles, for instance, could not supersede a state militia law, because such statute would not have been made in pursuance of the Constitution, but in contempt of the Constitution. Again, the Supreme Court's decision in Norton v. Shelby County reminds us that, quote, "An unconstitutional act is not a law. It imposes no duties. It is in legal contemplation, as inoperative as though it had never been passed." End quote.
Another area, the states could simply pass legislation saying that these gun-controlled statutes are not going to be applied. The militia structure is part of the Constitution. So there's no way that Congress can pass a statute that somehow makes an inroad on the militia, disarms the militia, for instance, because the Constitution itself prevents it. The Supremacy Clause doesn't even come into play there. The states can be standing on their constitutional authority to maintain the militia of the several states in an armed manner.
Even if a gun control law were valid in the benighted District of Columbia, it would not be valid in the states because maintenance of the militia is one of the primary attributes of state sovereignty, which the Constitution explicitly recognizes. Congress cannot pass any legislation that abridges any attribute of state sovereignty.
Henry David Thoreau is one of the guys in history who he's still famous, even though he said some things that are still pretty darn radical. And he recognized that having respect for politician commands, which they call laws, isn't really worth anything. It doesn't do humanity any good. In fact, it does the opposite, because it will lead people to do things that otherwise they would recognize as evil because, well, it's the law. We have to follow the law. Even if it doesn't match our own morals and our own virtues, we have to follow it because it's the law.
Thus, all general gun control legislation emanating from the federal government is subject to being disregarded and rendered ineffective by the states on the basis of the militia clauses in the Constitution alone, with no reference to the Second Amendment even necessary.
It's only the people who stand up against it who see the brute force inherent in all government. The people who went along with slavery when it was legal, they didn't get in trouble. The people who saw that as evil and say, we're not going to put up with that. I don't care if you call it law. We're not going to put up with that. They're the ones who saw the violent inherent in the system.
Bear in mind, in drafting the Constitution, the Founding Fathers made no attempt to disband the militia, not even to clear ground for some new military establishment under the rubric of militia.
The militia was an important part of the concept of the new republic. It was their idea that the power, the military power, the power of the sword should retain with the states. After all, the American Union, United States of America, was a union of 13 governments, 13 states. And it was the concept to keep the military power in the hands of those 13 states.
The founders understood and respected the militia, and this is precisely why they constitutionalized the militia, so Congress could never compromise it. Thus, when Congress is charged with the responsibility to provide for organizing the militia, this power should be contrasted with its power to raise armies and provide and maintain a navy.
The Army and the Navy is a creature, an entity of the federal government itself. The militia is something that belongs to and is comprised of the people of the several states. And it's not under the authority of Washington. It's under the authority of local leaders and governors of states.
The Constitution is clear. Congress has the option, but not the obligation, to raise an army and provide a navy, whereas the militia are permanent and must be accommodated by Congress as part of the very sovereignty of we the people. The military-industrial complex is thus unconstitutional to the degree it supports the deterioration of the militia.
Military-industrial complex is just, for definition purposes, the giant corporations that arise around support services, providing support services to the military. And that would usually be tanks and guns and weapons and ammo. They get an inordinate amount of influence over the American government with their wealth and power, with their money. They start influencing politicians, and that has an undue effect on just government because it distorts the process of government as defined in the Constitution, where it is the people. As a group of individuals, all of us as a family of Americans ruling over our own government.
The military-industrial complex, the rise of a permanent, established, standing army, and the industrial complex that supports it is unconstitutional to the degree that it supplants the militia and erodes the responsibility and duty and the ability of the people to serve in that capacity.
We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Of the three requirements for the militia, organization, arms, and discipline, arms are the most important, for even a rabble can eventually organize and develop discipline if at least armed. But unarmed people are almost always helpless, hapless, and hopeless.
They're not culturally brought up to know how to defend yourself. If you're taught how to use a sword or a pistol or your fist, you're being brought up by people that are teaching you to not be a slave. If you're brought up in the nanny state, then you're being brought up to be a slave. Slaves are disarmed, and then they're financially disarmed. Their jobs are taken. Their families are broken up until you enter a North Korean type situation, the dream of all statists.
To ensure the militia would always be able to arm itself, the founders did not charge Congress with the exclusive responsibility for arming citizens. It should be obvious that were the provision of arms a government monopoly, it would be easy for any usurper or tyrant to disarm the population by refusing to provide arms.
The British had embargoed the importation of ball and powder, ammunition, so that the founders might have their musket, might have their Brown Bess rifle, but they wouldn't have any ammunition for it. So they developed their own domestic sources for those.
In a report to expose the ease of buying this .50 caliber military-style sniper rifle, I wanted to make sure I could buy ammunition. That turned out to be as easy as ordering flowers.
The lesson still is a good one today. We need to be able to count on domestic sources for the production of firearms and ammunition in the United States.
In addition, the framers wanted numerous outlets around the country where citizens could purchase arms, so no monopoly, public or private, could develop.
And Drew Griffin of CNN Special Investigations Unit is joining us now. Pretty eye-opening report, Drew. Have there been attempts to regulate the sale of ammo online?
Per the Constitution, we the people are supposed to keep our own firearms in our own possession at all times.
They believed that it was the responsibility of the citizens to choose the arms that they wanted to use and to become familiar with them and to have a sense of possession with them, because after all, it was their responsibility to use those arms.
And then, of course, the ultimate purpose of the militia, the maintenance of a free state, looks to the possibility of usurpation and tyranny. Usurpation and tyranny by whom? By public officials. They're the only ones who can usurp and tyrannize by definition. So if the arms of the militia were kept in armories or magazines under the control of public officials who might themselves be the usurpers and the tyrants, then obviously the militia could not possibly function to overturn usurpation and tyranny.
Obviously, these strategies provide the only way to guarantee effectiveness of a militia against usurpation and tyranny.
The militia of the several states still exists. It was never outlawed because it was never shut down. It never did cease to exist. There was no law, no act ever passed that says there won't be any more militias. It's just that they have succeeded in convincing people that that authority of the militia no longer exists.
The permanent incorporation of the militia into the Constitution requires the states to train and maintain their militia, whatever Congress may or may not do. And this is quite feasible, for we train at schools, colleges, and vocation classes 3, 4, or 5 times a week. Attend churches 3 or 4 times a month, and even take such things as music lessons 50 times a year.
Most of the men of the colonies were church-going men. They would have their church services in the morning, and then they would go out into the lawn, into the places nearby, and then they would drill as militia in the afternoon.
So why can't we attend militia training just 3 or 4 times a year? After all, this training could be the most important of all, for it provides the very security that makes all the other training even possible.
If there were something resembling the Swiss system, a universal militia, there would be a much greater likelihood that if somebody were unstable, that they would be spotted, because they would be put at least 2 or 3 weeks a year in a kind of intense period. And if they couldn't take those pressures and they reacted in strange ways, they could be called out and dealt with without having the tremendous state system that we now have, which frankly isn't very effective anyway.
It would only be a short time before men and women in the community spotted individuals who were unstable.
If I walked into a gun store to you and I look like a nut, a crazy person, would you sell me a gun?
No, and frequently gun dealers experience that. And
so if you could call up and find out in a matter
Today, we are at the mercy of psychiatrists and police that are rarely on the scene at the right time.
It is believed that the guns that they used were all legally purchased at stores and gun shows, and many of the bullets were bought at the Littleton Kmart just down the street.
In colonial America, shooting rampages almost never happened because the whole population of free, able-bodied males comprised the militia and was always armed with the latest firearms suitable for military service.
Those arms actually include almost any type of arms that you could imagine. Let's look at the reasons that the militia could be called forth pursuant to some directive from Congress. Well, the third one is to repel invasions. What sort of arms might an invader have? Well, they wouldn't be coming with muskets, or they wouldn't be coming with single-shot shotguns, right? They'd be coming with the most modern infantry arms, certainly, that they could obtain, equivalent to what the United States Army or the Marines, for instance, would have. So to perform the function of repelling invasions, the members of the militia should have, unless he's a conscientious objector, he should have something like an AR-15 or maybe an M16 rifle. Suppress insurrections is another one of the 3 purposes for which the militia can be called forth. Well, an insurrection might be a local riot, in which case it would be sufficient to have the type of firearms that the police use, handguns or shotguns, sometimes fully automatic weapons. All of those would be necessary to perform the militia functions, and who would have particular types of arms would depend upon what kind of duty you were performing in the militia.
Gun control laws and so-called assault weapon bans intended to prohibit citizens' possession of state-of-the-art arms are thus unconstitutional. Since Congress has the power and duty to provide for calling forth the militia, it would be next to useless to call forth a militia for homeland security were it not properly organized, fully armed, and well-disciplined.
The Second Amendment's reference to a well-regulated militia is a reference to a militia that is regularly organized, armed, disciplined, that is properly armed and knows how to use the arms under tactics that is agreed upon, that it can be coordinated with other companies, battalions, regiments, divisions, and even other states, and can fight effectively. Certainly it's the antithesis of what we have today, where for almost 100 years we've been so lazy that we've forgotten all organization and certainly don't exercise it.
But again, this is the undisclosed strategy behind the gun controllers' plans of usurpation. Atrophy the militia so we the people can't be effective in providing our own homeland security necessary for a free state.
We've all heard the idea that if you put a frog in cold water and gradually heat the pot, the frog will stay in the water and never jump out and allow himself to be boiled to death. Whereas if you drop him into a pan of really hot water, he'll jump out immediately. And I think it's true when you relate this to human nature, that people do get used to incremental increases of tyranny. They get used to greater and greater inconveniences and insults from government until finally they'll just accept the total package.
Yes, the gun controllers know exactly what they are doing, and the mainstream media, being part of the gun controllers' arsenal, never allows guests on shows to discuss the real purposes of the Second Amendment. Their long-term mission is to slowly boil the frog, slowly disarm we the people, so that, without noticing, we fall into their hands like ripened fruit, as the cultural Marxist Antonio Gramsci wrote.
Antonio Gramsci was an Italian communist who went to the Soviet Union and observed it under Lenin and Stalin and declared that Lenin and Stalin may have full power here and rule here, but they have not won the hearts of the people. The people detest communism. They love Russia. They love their Orthodox religion. And Gramsci went back to Italy, where he was imprisoned by Mussolini, and he wrote that in order to really take over a country and take over the world, communism basically had to remove from the interior of people Christianity, their Christian beliefs, their love of country, all of these things that made people behave as they did, and replace them with a much more totally secularist and Marxist ideology.
So, what exactly is the gun control lobby? In a word, it's what's known as the globalists.
A globalist propaganda corps here to disarm the American people so that they can have a re-education, hot purge, red terror style takeover of our country.
Because they know that if you have a tyrannical government and you're forcing people to do things that they don't want to do, supposedly in the name of society, people aren't going to go along with it and they will rebel. And so it's important to make sure that if they rebel, all they've got is clubs and sticks, while they, the military of the governments of the world, have got all the powerful weapons.
These are your gun controllers, and they vehemently oppose the Second Amendment, especially the militia. This is why you never, ever hear the word militia uttered on their corporate or government-sponsored networks, except in a disparaging way.
You're an unbelievably stupid man, aren't you?
You would rather have people be victims of a crime than be able to defend themselves. It's incomprehensible.
The mainstream media is fundamentally on the side of supporting any and all gun control measures, no matter how basically extreme.
And they basically push this unified front that you're bad because you believe in the Second Amendment that this country was founded on. 1776 happened because the Redcoats came for the ball and powder. They came for the guns. Texas got founded because Santa Anna tried to disarm Texans who'd become Mexican citizens. So the truth is, the people demonizing the Second Amendment are the real enemies of the Republic.
If the communist leader, Mao Zedong, is correct that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, the gun controllers are an elite that is applying Mao's principle to wrest political power from we the people, here in the U.S. and the rest of the world. Their goal is to consolidate all arms and weapons under their sole authority by invalidating and destroying the right of the people to consolidate arms and weapons under their authority.
True globalists would like to see basically national governments and countries yield more and more power to transnational and global institutions. Their model for the world is the European Union, where the European countries yield up portions of their sovereignty to transnational institutions like the European Commission, and these transnational institutions are able to impose their agendas on individual countries. So I think this is the overall objective of the globalists, and of course in order to achieve that and to prevent a global government from being overthrown would require the disarmament of the citizens of individual countries.
This small but powerful international group is comprised of members of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderbergers, pundits in the New York mainstream media, liberal celebrities employed by the Hollywood-based MPAA studio distributors, corporate fascists in multinationals, bankers in the Federal Reserve System, IMF and BIS executives, neocons who have co-opted the GOP, United Nations supporters, Marxists infiltrating America's cultural institutions, and the U.S. military-industrial complex that serves the UN's global standing army, NATO.
The mood of this city is entirely behind the idea of globalization, the effect of which has been basically to deindustrialize a significant slice of America. We lost 6 million manufacturing jobs during the decade from 2000 to 2010 and 55,000 factories. If you want to know why the real wages of working Americans have not gone up in real terms since the 1970s, globalization is the reason.
This is what a globalist does, consciously or unconsciously, directly and indirectly, in order to facilitate their one-world government, often called the New World Order.
George H.W. Bush, President George H.W. Bush, used the term at the United Nations in 1991, and he used it basically to describe a world in which the United States and Great Britain and the Western nations would take the lead in basically establishing a world order after the Cold War was over. But that is different than some ideas of the New World Order, say of Immanuel Kant and others whose idea is of global governance and a global government.
Now, it's not just any kind of a world government. If it were the kind of a world government that was based on the principles of individualism and freedom and respect for human rights and all the things that our original Constitution guaranteed to the American people, I think it'd be a wonderful thing. But that's not the kind of world government they're building in New York at the United Nations.
The big mega banks have said they want a planetary world bank that you pay carbon taxes to. And it's the big banks that are lobbying and funding Bloomberg and others to take our guns. In fact, many foreign banks. And so the world government's in our face, but the Southern Poverty Law Center comes out and says it doesn't exist, and you're a terrorist if you're a gun owner and believe in it.
There are many, many people who believe in global governance, and there are the basic rudimentary institutions of global government. The UN, the World Trade Organization, the International Criminal Court, the European Union is sort of a model of global government.
So that's what they're trying to build, and I suppose some of them think that it's in the best interest of society, but whether you agree or not, the fact is that if they succeed, you as an individual and I as individuals will not have the right to do anything without permission of the state. And we'll be totally regimented, and I think it'll be George Orwell's 1984 finally arrived.
The skeptic should at least acknowledge this. Since the Constitution guarantees a republican form of limited government and a free state, anyone who works against these principles has to be suspect.
The Constitution of the United States guarantees to all of the states a republican form of government. And inasmuch as the United States is made up solely of the states, and all of the states must have a republican form of government, it follows that the United States as a collective is a republican form of government. And the one thing that is outstanding in every one of them was every one of them had a militia, a state militia, formed and operated on essentially the exact same principles.
So important is the militia to our constitutional principles, its role parallels the preamble to the Constitution itself. The first purpose of the militia is to execute the laws of the Union, which is to establish justice. The second purpose of the militia is to suppress insurrections, which is to ensure domestic tranquility. And the third purpose of the militia is to repel invasions, which serves to provide for the common defense. Thus, the Founding Fathers saw that the militia would provide the primary forces to serve the preamble's purposes.
When you look at the elements of that preamble, promoting the general welfare, the blessings of liberty, etc., can only be ensured by an armed society. There is no common defense without an armed society. There is no domestic tranquility without an armed society. It always comes down to the right of the people to keep and bear arms.
Usurpation and tyranny by individuals in high office are bound to be abnormal situations and constitute the most serious possible violations of the Constitution.
Now, it does raise a question, what do you do, though, when Congress is full of oath breakers and the presidency is dominated by an oath breaker and the courts are oath breakers? Then what do you do? Who then executes and enforces the Constitution? I don't think Congress is going to call forth the militia or the president to enforce the Constitution against himself. But in the final recourse, in defense of our rights, in defense of using the tool of nullification, I think it would be the purpose of the militia would also that they could support and defend the Constitution even against Congress or the President. The Congress or the President oversteps their bounds.
The Constitution delegates to Congress the power to provide for calling forth the militia for three purposes, one of which is to execute the laws of the Union. The Constitution is one of the laws of the Union. According to its own explicit terms, it is the supreme law of the Union. Therefore, under appropriate circumstances, the militia could be called forth to execute the Constitution.
Because the militia may be called forth to execute the laws of the Union, and because the Constitution is the supreme law of the Union, the militia may be called forth to execute the Constitution itself.
If Congress or the President were to call forth the militia for an unconstitutional reason, to enforce an unconstitutional law, the governor of the state has no duty to send his men. That's the great safety valve of having the militia be the body that is there to execute the Union. A standing army, a professional warrior class that's under the perpetual command of the Commander-in-Chief, the President, is much more likely to go along.
The Constitution must fully empower the state militia to suppress such rogue individuals, and, in the extreme, even justify the militia calling themselves forth, as they did at Lexington and Concord in 1775.
The militia must always be in a position, when faced with usurpers or tyrants or other kinds of rogue public officials, to assert a superior authority, because if their authority is not superior, if the usurpers, tyrants, and rogues can claim superior authority, then they will be successful in their usurpation, tyranny, or other illegal activity. And the militia will not, in fact, be capable of executing the laws of the Union, which is their constitutional responsibility. They will not be capable of maintaining the security of a free state.
The Constitution is a document to restrain the government. And if you don't obey the Constitution, then you don't restrain government, you expand government. If you look at what's happened in the last 100 years, I mean, whether it's foreign policy, attack on civil liberties, or economic policy, it's government intervention constantly growing, and Republicans or Democrats. It's always more instead of less. And I think basically that it's because they don't follow their oath of office. You know, we tell our kids, obey the rules, then they find out, well, the government doesn't obey the rules, and then they get confused, so they like to hear, at least some people do believe that we ought to obey the rules and take the oath of office seriously.
It is important to realize that true homeland security, the purposes for which the Constitution says the militia may be called forth, does not mean the security of mere individuals who happen to temporarily hold public office. And it does not mean the security of the wealthy, well-connected, or unscrupulous special interest groups that feather their nests at the expense of common citizens, while rigging elections, prostituting public office, looting the national treasury, and dispatching America's youth to undeclared wars.
All public officials in the United States are required to take an oath or make an affirmation to support the Constitution. So if an individual is usurping authority, he's attempting to exercise a power that is outside of the area in which he can constitutionally operate, and therefore he's violating his oath or affirmation, and similarly for tyranny, because the Constitution doesn't provide any powers that allow people to exercise tyranny over anyone. But the real usurper is one who understands that what he's doing is not within his authority, and of course the real tyrant is trying to overthrow the entire legal system.
Homeland security means the security of a republican form of government and a free state. A free state composed of we the people, administered for the benefit of we the people, and guaranteed by we the people with their own arms in their own hands.
Homeland security is the globalist system to absorb the old republic and federalize things. The citizen spies, the surveillance, all of it. And interestingly enough, Homeland Security 10 years ago hired consultants from the former Soviet Union and East Germany to come over and set it up. So it is totally alien to America, and it's the opposite of our republic's security.
So, to be constitutionally legitimate, any program of homeland security must be fashioned around the militia of the several states, not the armed forces or national intelligence agencies, and especially not some cabinet-level department in Washington, D.C., constructed like the Ministry of Interior of an East European Stalinist regime of the 1950s.
They didn't call it Homeland Security, they called it security of the motherland or the fatherland, that sort of thing. I guess it was Russia that called it the motherland, and the Germans called it the fatherland, and we call it the homeland, and so forth. But it's all the same concept, and the idea is that it's supposed to protect us against some horrible tragedy, an invasion, or some crime, some invading army or terrorism or something like that. And the people usually go along with it because they're scared to death. They need to be protected, they think. And so the concepts are exactly the same. There's nothing new in the Department of Homeland Security in the United States that didn't exist in these previous tyrannical systems except one thing, and that is the technology has advanced a lot since then, and the Homeland Security can now do much, much more in the way of controlling people than any of those other regimes could dream of doing.
In the wake of 9/11, neither Congress, the President, nor any elected official even considered a constitutional solution to the problem of homeland security, as Americans routinely did for some 300 years prior. It's as if the power elite in Washington, D.C. has forgotten that the Constitution even exists.
Well, the power elite in Washington, the Constitution is a thorn in their side, and once the government gets to the point where it starts taking more authority than it has a legitimate right to claim, that's when the people are correct in objecting to it.
The militia recognized by the Constitution are always subject to governmental approval, supervision, and command. Thus, no matter how patriotically motivated, mere groups of men equipped with firearms do not comprise a constitutional militia.
But there is still a tradition among Americans that individual citizens have a right to keep and bear arms to protect their own homes, their property, their family, and their lives, and that right has been upheld by the United States Supreme Court, most recently in the Heller decision of 2007.
But I think I'd caution people about the definition of patriotism. You know, I think there's been some gross distortions on that, because right now I'm accused of being unpatriotic, you know, because I don't want to fight a war that's not declared. I want to bring the troops home, and I want to obey the Constitution, and they call me un-American, unpatriotic. Yet I think the important thing, whether it's defending the militia or whatever, a patriotic person defends the people and the principles of a country.
Typically, all able-bodied men and women from 16 to 55 years of age are subject to enrollment in the militia of their respective states. Unless he or she is a conscientious objector, each is required to possess one or more firearms, along with a supply of ammunition and accoutrements.
it's not just a right, it's also a duty that you need to fulfill, just like you have a duty to serve on a jury if you're called. If you leave that to the so-called professionals, you will wind up with a warrior class over you who eventually will see themselves as separate, as above you, superior to you, and you as a second-class citizen. If you are the militia, if you are the militia of the people and responsible for your own security, that's much less likely to happen. So it's incredibly important for everyone to accept that duty and step up.
Thus, if this is what the supreme law of the land requires, how can a gun control lobby of either public officials or private citizens be legally pushing to disarm American citizens?
There are some members of the gun control lobby who really, in a sense, don't understand what they're doing. They may have a good faith belief that these various gun control provisions that they're proposing will have a good effect, and they simply don't think about or don't understand the constitutional ramifications of what they're doing. On the other hand, there are many people in the gun control lobby to whom one cannot attribute ignorance. And I take in particular ones who are public officials. They have taken an oath to support the Constitution. And when you take an oath or affirmation to support the Constitution, you're at least implicitly saying that you understand what the Constitution means, because you can't possibly support something that you don't understand what it means.
Given what the Second Amendment stands for, and given the clear contradictions in the goals of the gun control lobby, how is the promotion of contemporary gun control laws not a subversive, even criminal activity?
You're a hatchet man of the New World Order. Okay. You're a hatchet man. You're not going to pull on America's heartstrings. They know your script, okay? You're not going to get our guns.
I've pointed out that Piers Morgan and all these other globalist agents are engaged in criminal acts. That's why I've said deporting. They are here engaged in subterfuge, trying to overthrow our established republic and our law. And you have free speech as a citizen, but you do not have free speech when you try to overthrow the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence.
Well, their purpose ultimately here is to take arms out of the hands of the people, and ultimately this will destroy the security of a free state, because unarmed people through the militia are the security of a free state. And what happens if you don't have a free state? Well, you have some other kind of state.
The absolute nature of the right of the people to keep and bear arms is precisely what one would expect from the Second Amendment's precept that a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. Therefore, a free state is one in which everyone possesses his own firearms, knows why he is armed, opposes every attempt to disarm him, and, with his arms and training, fulfills his duties to provide security in just proportion with everyone else.
A free state is a limited government created simply to defend the free state itself, so that the people, the juries, the grand juries, the voters, the citizens, the posse, the militia, the civil defense can bring lawbreakers, criminals, murderers to justice in a people's tribunal, in a people's court.
In a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms is absolute. Anything less could never provide adequate security. It would always enable a police state to develop. The police would always end up outgunning the common citizens. Another Stalin's Russia, Nazi Germany, or Mao's China.
Second Amendment says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Was that some kind of delusional statement on the part of the Founding Fathers? A free state is one in which the people themselves are the sovereigns. The people are the ultimate governors. The sovereign in any society is that group which controls the ultimate force in society. If you're going to have a dictatorship, then the dictator and his cronies and a standing army or secret police force or whatever will have that power. If you're going to have popular sovereignty, then the people will have that power.
The YouTube film entitled Innocents Betrayed, produced by Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership, documents the hopelessness of populations that have been disarmed or outgunned by their governments throughout history.
What happens when self-defense is against the law? What happens when the protectors become the predators? What happens when innocents are betrayed? Imagine that 2/3 of all Americans disappear.
The police are not meant to be able to outgun the citizens. We didn't even have police forces until New York in the 1840s, and then they were famous gangs that abused people. It's the citizens that are the real police, but now the servants are trying to become the masters, and that's basically what's been happening.
The Founding Fathers would have looked at our modern police forces as standing armies of a kind. The police should not be allowed to outgun the common citizens, because the common citizens are supposed to be functioning in the militia. The militia is supposed to be a check and balance against standing armies. If the police are looked at as standing armies, then clearly the militia should have firearms at least as good as what the police have in case the police should go rogue.
Thus, unfettered private possession of arms is absolutely necessary for the security of a free state. Only private possession of state-of-the-art arms can maximize both readiness and deterrence, particularly against usurpers and tyrants in office, who historically have proven to be most dangerous to every free state.
So naturally, you can understand why these politicians that are reaching for more and more and more power might get a little nervous about a large population that's armed. It makes sense. But other than that, I cannot think of anybody in their right mind who want to take away the right to have and bear arms to protect yourself against tyranny.
The right of the people to keep and bear arms thus encompasses the freedom to carry arms, whether open or concealed. It also encompasses the necessity to assemble with such arms in constant readiness for militia purposes.
It's absurd to think that law-abiding citizens that are well-armed, you're going to have something as absurd as like a shootout at the OK Corral. That would be something like a Pierce Morgan would say.
Quite possibly they could have taken this guy out and saved people's lives.
Or you could have had the gunfight at the OK Corral in there and lost even more lives, couldn't you? Let's take a break.
What roll of the dice would you like? You'd prefer to be unarmed? How many people here think I make crackpot points?
Yeah.
One. How many think I make sensible points? You're in a minority, my good friend.
Schools, college campuses, movie theaters, airports, and yes, even jets cannot be so-called gun-free zones.
Private businesses may choose not to allow firearms, but as far as public places, there shouldn't be. I know in New Hampshire, you can bring an open carry firearm into the state assembly.
We have the President of the United States has armed bodyguards all the time. If the presence of arms is so dangerous, then he should lead by example and dismiss his Secret Service officers or take away their guns and tell them that the White House is now a gun-free zone.
The awareness on the part of potential criminals, terrorists, usurpers, and tyrants that untold numbers of citizens are, or could be, carrying firearms in public and private places deters antisocial behavior at the microcosmic level and the macrocosmic level.
If you had armed citizens at Columbine High or armed citizens in Aurora, a lot of people who are dead and a lot of people who were wounded would not be wounded today and would not be dead today because a citizen with a concealed carry could have stopped this individual or might have stopped this individuals before they carried out their atrocities.
Under the Constitution and Bill of Rights, you can have a gun anywhere you want. So they start curtailing it in one place, then they curtail it and then ban it everywhere else. So the only place you can curtail firearms is on private property. But then if you operate a mall or something as a commons and then advertise it as a gun-free zone, you only invite the killers.
Had the gun control lobby in Colorado not disarmed their citizens in gun-free zones, the twin massacres at Columbine High School and the midnight movie screening of Batman would have been unlikely. Had the gun control lobby in Nazi Germany not disarmed its citizens, the Holocaust would also have been unlikely.
Free states is the backbone of not just the Second Amendment, but all of the other fundamental tenets of freedom. The states and the recognition of the power and authority that states have is the greatest hindrance and obstacle to the accruing of power in one central government.
A well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. In its absence, such a state cannot survive. And this is exactly what the gun control lobby wants: the termination of the free state.
Every tyrant or would-be tyrant loves to accrue power to one central government.
To this end, they are active and strategically located not only among the intelligentsia, major media, and educational establishment, but most ominously in the law profession culture. But the propagandistic and political power these people wield is not overwhelming.
The gun control lobby would have nothing if they didn't have the media and a bunch of politicians.
The Second Amendment is bullshit. Why doesn't anyone go at the core of it?
Wait a minute, Bill.
Oh, really? David Stockman? Well,
the gun control lobby is mainly talking heads on the evening news and politicians like Senators Feinstein and Schumer.
Just as they have been defeated in the past, the partisans of radical gun control can be defeated in the future.
We've had enough of the development of highly militarized kinds of weapons.
It's not in order.
So I think eternal vigilance is the price of liberty, and I think that is what people who believe in the Second Amendment are going to have to maintain.
Ultimately, effective exercise of the militia powers can provide the skills Americans need to not only provide homeland security against terrorism, but advance the right to keep and bear arms.
We had those rights long before this country was even formed as humans.
Every able-bodied man in Switzerland, and I think many of the women as well, are part of the official military of Switzerland. And if you look at Switzerland, you'll find one of the lowest crime rates in the world. Is this an accident? Is this a coincidence? No, this is just the result of common sense.
In 1776, Thomas Paine observed a unique opportunity facing his fellow colonists. They were not only living on a vast new continent replete with seemingly endless resources, but a continent that had no entrenched government.
He was a brilliant philosopher, and his book, Common Sense, probably did more to educate, inspire, and inform than maybe any other writings that were written at the time.
By declaring independence from the Old World, the colonists could start over. They could create a brand new country with a brand new type of government, one that had never existed before. Not only did Thomas Paine see this opportunity to begin the world again, so did other political geniuses. And these sages converged on 18th century Philadelphia to draft what became the two most important political documents ever written: the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution.
They wanted George Washington to be king, as a matter of fact. Many of the people in America assumed, well, now we won the war, so who's our new king going to be? And that little group of men in Philadelphia that drafted the new Constitution, I don't know where they came from, but they were students, they were scholars, and they were men of such great principle that they rejected that offer of power for themselves. They said, no, we're going to break with tradition. We're not going to take over power over the people. We're going to build a new system where the people are in charge. They are the sovereign ones. That had never been done before.
The Constitution was the blueprint for a real new world order, not the cheap imitation globalists and their gun controllers are trying to foist upon populations today.
The New World Order, of course, that they have in mind is a globalist government where national boundaries are diminished for the betterment of the global traders. But in order to achieve that, you have to have international law. You have to have a police arm in order to create this global economy that you salivate over. That's the New World Order that they see. And the desire for global trade, again, that the British Empire had instituted. And many, many countries had fallen victim to that international law that the Crown was implementing globally.
The United States was the first major breakaway of a major colony from a great monarchical imperial power in Europe, which then dominated the world. And the breakaway was not only successful in establishing American independence and freedom, but the Americans created a republic, a new kind of government, which served as a model for peoples all over the world and was a tremendous success and became the strongest, most powerful, most successful, and richest country on earth.
They always say, oh, you want that old Constitution. The Constitution is the most revolutionary idea ever. What the globalists are going back to is 3,000, 4,000, 5,000-year-old Egyptian or Babylonian or even Middle Age domination from 1,000 years ago. They're the old world order. Tyrants and combines and victim disarmament and enslaved peasants is the old world. The Republic in America is the real New World Order.
The founders' New World Order was based on 4,000 years of experience with previous governments. What did these governments do right? What did they do wrong? All of this thought was hammered into the U.S. Constitution.
The history of the Constitution's peculiar taking notice of and peculiar clauses governing the perpetuation of the militia of the several states into our larger compound constitutional order was the history of a couple hundred years experience of self-government on this continent. Tried and true methods that were perfected in all the statutes and the constitutions or charters of the several colonies and then the constitutions of the several states, and the experience of trying to use on a large scale that element of our defense during the War of Independence, and the frustrations and trial and error there were all crystallized into the clauses of our current Constitution.
236 years later, this noble Constitution has guided 13 sparsely populated colonies to a free nation of over 300 million, what Thomas Paine would surely characterize as the noblest, purest nation on the face of the earth.
The idea that people could govern themselves was relatively new. In the 1600s, late 1600s, early 1700s, this was really coming out of the ideas of John Locke, Rousseau. But the debate goes back to the Republic, the debate between Plato and Aristotle. Wherein does justice lie then, Socrates? Some say it lies in the interest of the state, and some say it's in the interest of the subjects.
As a self-governing republic, we the people have inherited something unique, if we can keep it.
And the "if we could keep it" is a reference to whether or not we understand what it means to have a limited government, a constitutional republic. A republic being a government that has to operate under laws that can't be changed by even a majority vote, can only be changed by supermajorities going through a very lengthy and difficult process. As long as we keep the government to living within those means, we will have kept our freedom.
Sure, this nation has problems, but nothing that can't be solved by a proper application of the Constitution. All of it.
You know, a lot of people think I might be pessimistic because we have so many problems up here and they're so overwhelming and they're not making any progress. The truth is I'm pretty optimistic. I'm optimistic for a couple reasons. One is I visit the campuses and I know a lot of people have come out age 14 up to 30, and they seem to be very, very interested in this message of liberty, and they realize that we're at a turning point. Things are changing. But one of the things that I think is very important is the educational system. And that is the reason I have such a soft spot in my heart for homeschooling. I believe homeschooling can overcome, even though it's a small percentage of people now, I think it's going to continue to grow. And I think people that have homeschooling are much more likely to reach the right conclusions than if you depend on a government school that's going to preach pro-government stuff.
The government-approved spectrum of ideas is always about, well, how much should they take of what you earn? How much should they control you? You know, should we have a 3% tax increase or a 2% tax decrease? And that is pitched as if that is the entire spectrum of possible ideas you can have. And if some wacko comes along and says, how about if we each spend our own money? The concept is so foreign to most people because they never heard that in school, that they don't know how to process it. And all this time, they thought they were open-minded. They thought they were being exposed to all these different views, when basically they just got a few flavors of tyranny.
The most hopeful sign that we will be able to keep it is the probability that 80 million gun owners in America understand the principles behind the Second Amendment. Obvious to them is the concept that gun ownership is not only about self-defense, hunting, and target shooting. It's about keeping our freedoms and way of life.
It's a nice environment, it's a nice place.
The gun owners of America have what I would call a subconscious understanding of the real purpose of the Second Amendment. For a long time, they focused on what would really be called shooting sports, hunting or target shooting. More recently, the emphasis has been on personal protection.
If you limit the American public's access to semi-automatic technology, you limit their ability to survive. If someone's invading your house, I mean, you shouldn't say you should only have 5 or 6 shots. You ought to have what you need to protect yourself, a woman should, not what some politician thinks is reasonable.
But there's a recognition now coming to the fore that you cannot defend a community against tyranny through an individual right to keep and bear arms. And the individual hiding in his cellar with his own handgun or rifle is not going to be an effective deterrent, let alone be able effectively to resist. You need community organization, community self-defense, and of course the word for that in the Constitution, or words for that in the Constitution, a well-regulated militia.
This subject, known as the power of the sword, is not complex. Even if MOLON LABE is your first exposure, there is no reason you cannot quickly master the key points and pass them on.
There's an inexorable drive on the part of people to have government assert greater and greater power over individuals and their decision-making, over the economy, and over politics. And the only guarantee of a free people is eternal vigilance and a willingness to resist and oppose what's going on.
Self-government is not a spectator sport. And if you are not governing yourself, someone else is going to appear to govern you. There will be some kind of government there. And if it isn't popular sovereignty, it will be unpopular sovereignty in one sense or another. And you can imagine what that something else will be, simply looking at all of those societies in the 20th century that went down the other road, where the people let the bureaucrats or the standing army or whatever, eventually the dictator and the secret police, serve the exclusive role of governance. And then the people became the subjects of that governance instead of the controllers of that governance.
So, what are we going to do about the usurpers and rogue politicians working against the U.S. Constitution? What are we going to do about the globalists seeking a return to the old world order, an order saturated with war and chaos, oligarchy and totalitarianism? The founders pulled America out of this quicksand 2 centuries ago, and their vision of liberty remains the world's hope to this very day. But liberty is a tide that ebbs and flows, an evasive luxury that only remains abundant when certain principles are applied. And one of those principles, the necessity of a well-regulated militia, is found in the Second Amendment, the amendment that guarantees America's freedom.